The text arrived on a quiet morning. My sister's wedding details filled the screen, a cascade of polished images and elegant plans. But beneath it all, in a private note from my older sister, there was one sentence that stopped me cold. "You can come, but do not wear your uniform. We want grace, not reminders of war." I read those words again and again, as if repetition could somehow soften the sting. For 20 years, I had worn that uniform through dust storms and convoy routes in Afghanistan, through nights when the walls of a field hospital shook under rocket fire, through the steady hum of helicopters lifting away the broken and the brave. I earned a Bronze Star not because I sought recognition, but because I carried men out of fire when no one else could reach them. That uniform was not cloth and thread. It was sacrifice. It was the faces of soldiers I kept alive. Yet to my own family, it was nothing but an eyesore, a reminder of something they wanted erased. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. And share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It is always moving to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. I set the phone down, and the silence of the room pressed in around me. It struck me then how rejection from your own blood can echo louder than the crack of gunfire. I had been told many things in my life by commanding officers and battlefield surgeons, by weary soldiers and grateful families. But never had I been told that the very life I had lived, the very uniform that had shaped me, was unwelcome at a celebration meant to bind family together. To them, I was not Captain Evelyn Hayes, veteran and medic. I was simply the sister who could make people uncomfortable, the one whose presence threatened the shine of their perfect day. That realization cut deeper than any shrapnel ever had. I leaned back in my chair and let the memories roll in like a storm front. The dusty roads, the smell of antiseptic and iron, the weight of a fellow soldier's body slung across my shoulders. I had thought the hardest battles were behind me, but in that moment, I knew the truth. Sometimes the battlefield is not a desert halfway around the world. Sometimes it is your own living room. Sometimes it is the family that would rather hide your scars than face their meaning. And so, with that single message, a new battle began. Not of bullets and bombs, but of dignity. Of whether I would step into that wedding hall as the woman they wanted me to be, or as the soldier I had become. I was 8 years old the first time I realized I was not like my sisters. Caroline, the eldest, had hair that fell in perfect curls and a smile that seemed designed for yearbook covers. She was the one teachers praised, the one my mother adored in quiet, unspoken ways. My younger sister, Lily, was softer, gentler, a child who always knew the right words to calm a storm. And then there was me, Evelyn, the middle daughter who scraped her knees, climbed fences, and dreamed not of prom dresses but of uniforms. Our house smelled of lemon polish and lavender candles. It looked perfect from the outside, white shutters gleaming in the suburban sun. Inside, though, there was a script we were expected to follow. The Hayes girls had to shine. We had to sit straight at church, wear ribbons that matched, never raise our voices too loud. Caroline played the piano at holiday gatherings. Lily read poems at school contests. I was the one caught sneaking out with a flashlight and a library book about the Marines. My father would shake his head and mutter that I was restless. My mother would press her lips together, trying to turn her disappointment into silence, but silence can speak louder than words. That silence grew around me until I could almost hear it humming. Have you ever felt like you were the odd one out at your own dinner table? I wonder if any of you listening right now have known what it feels like to be the shadow in a family that only celebrates the light. If you have, tell me in the comments. Sometimes just naming that feeling helps us know we are not alone. By the time I was 16, Caroline was already applying to Ivy League schools and Lily was winning homecoming queen. I was the girl in the rock program, marching across the football field at dawn with boots that scuffed the pavement. To me, the cadence of marching was music. To my family, it was noise. I remember the day I told them I had decided to enlist. It was a humid July evening, and cicadas screamed from the trees as if the world itself was restless. We sat on the back porch, lemonade glasses sweating on the table. I told them I had met with a recruiter, that I wanted to become a medic. I thought maybe the word medic would soften the blow. After all, I would not be carrying a rifle. I would be carrying bandages, healing instead of destroying. But my mother's face froze, and my father cleared his throat the way he did when bad news arrived. Caroline rolled her eyes, already certain this was just another phase I would outgrow. Lily tried to smile, but even she could not hide the worry in her eyes. I was not choosing the path they had planned for me, and in that moment I felt the gap between us widen into something unbridgeable. The day I shipped out for boot camp, my parents drove me to the airport. There were no banners, no tears, no heartfelt words of pride. My mother hugged me stiffly, her perfume clinging to my uniform collar. My father said good luck in the same tone he used when I left for a school exam. Caroline did not come. Lily whispered a soft "stay safe" before turning away quickly, as if even those words cost her too much. I carried their half-hearted farewells with me through the gates. But when I stepped onto that plane, I also carried something else. A determination that if my family would not see me, the world would. Years later, after Afghanistan, after deployments that carved lines into my face and left aches deep in my bones, I came home with medals in a box and memories that rattled like loose bullets. I did not return the same. How could I? My body carried pain that flared on rainy days. My sleep was broken by the sharp edge of dreams. Some people called it PTSD. I called it a shadow that refused to leave my side. I expected my family to hold me closer, to wrap me in the comfort of home. Instead, they leaned away. My mother told neighbors I was tired from work but never mentioned the war. Caroline introduced me at parties as her sister Evelyn, who had been overseas, as if overseas were a vague place you might visit on vacation. Lily tried at first, asking careful questions, but when my answers carried weight she did not understand, she stopped asking. At Thanksgiving, I noticed how the conversation shifted whenever I entered the room. Talk of politics fell silent. Stories turned safe and shallow. I became the subject no one wanted to mention, the ghost at my own family's table. And maybe the cruelest part was that I still longed for their approval. After all the blood I had seen, all the lives I had fought to save, I still wanted my mother's hand on mine, telling me she was proud. I still wanted my father to look at me the way he looked at Caroline, with pride shining in his eyes. But that look never came. It was easier for them to tuck me away, to leave my name off invitations, to tell me they forgot to call, to let me drift. And slowly I realized the truth. My family did not know what to do with me. I was no longer the restless girl with scraped knees. I was a veteran with scars they could not understand, and instead of learning to see me, they chose to turn away. Have you ever come home to people who no longer knew how to speak to you? I ask because I know many veterans who carry that silent wound. If you have lived it, share in the comments. Your story might be the one that helps someone else feel less alone. That was when the hiding began. Invitations lost in the mail. Excuses about seating arrangements at parties. Photographs where my sisters smiled in perfect dresses and I was nowhere to be found. I was becoming invisible, edited out of the family album. And that was a wound deeper than shrapnel. Because while shrapnel cuts flesh, silence cuts the soul. The first Christmas after I returned from service should have been a homecoming. I imagined a tree lit with soft white lights, stockings hung, the smell of cinnamon and pine needles carrying me back to something familiar. I wanted laughter in the kitchen, the comfort of belonging. Instead, I walked into a house where my medals sat untouched in my suitcase and no one asked to see them. My mother handed me a mug of cocoa and told me not to bring up stories from overseas because they might unsettle the younger cousins. My father turned the television louder during the news so he would not have to hear me clear my throat. Caroline showed up late with her husband, dressed in red cashmere, her eyes scanning me once, then skipping past as if I were a stranger at the door. I stood there with my cocoa cooling in my hands, and I realized that I was both invited and unwelcome at the same time. My body was in the room, but my story was not. They wanted the shape of me without the truth of me. There is a particular loneliness in being surrounded by people who share your blood yet refuse to share your life. It is like shouting through glass. They see your lips move, but they never hear the words. Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people who claim to love you? if you have. Write yes in the comments. I promise you someone else will read it and nod, knowing exactly what you mean. Months turned into years, and each gathering was another reminder that I was the odd piece in their perfect puzzle. Weddings, baptisms, birthdays. Sometimes I was not invited at all. Other times I was given vague excuses. We only had so many seats. We thought you would be busy. The words were polite, but the truth underneath was sharp. They wanted a version of the Hayes family without me in the picture. At one point, Caroline asked me not to wear black to a baby shower because it made me look too severe. She laughed when she said it, but the laugh had edges. My mother started calling less, and when she did, she asked about my health the way one might ask about the weather, without really listening for the answer. Even Lily, the gentle one, began to mirror their silence. She told me once that I carried the war in my eyes and that it made people uncomfortable. I knew she did not mean to wound me, but she did. Because how do you separate yourself from the things you have seen? The sound of a helicopter blade cutting through night air. The weight of a soldier's hand slipping out of yours. Those things do not vanish. They live inside you. Sometimes I wondered if I should pretend. If I should smooth my edges, laugh more loudly, tell safer stories. But every time I tried, it felt like peeling away skin. I had already spent years giving everything I had to a cause bigger than myself. I could not come home and give away the last piece of truth I had left. One spring afternoon, Caroline hosted a fundraiser for her husband's firm at the country club. I found out about it only because an old neighbor mentioned it to me in the grocery store. I had not been invited. The neighbor smiled awkwardly, as if she realized too late that she had said the wrong thing. I stood there holding a carton of milk and wondering when exactly my family had decided I was not someone they wanted to show the world. That was the moment the wound shifted. Until then, I had thought maybe they forgot me, maybe it was clumsy love, maybe they just did not know how to handle the weight of what I carried. But that afternoon in the hum of the grocery store, I understood it was not forgetfulness. It was choice. They were choosing to hide me. And once you see that choice clearly, you cannot unsee it. It cut deeper than combat because it came not from an enemy but from my own blood. The rejection was deliberate, crafted with polite words and careful smiles. My family wanted to keep me behind closed doors, like a shadow too inconvenient to explain. Have you ever discovered that the people you trusted most were the very ones shutting you out? If that strikes a chord, share a word in the comments. Even one word is enough. Someone else will see it and know they are not the only one carrying that weight. I began to avoid gatherings myself, not because I did not want to be there, but because the silence inside those rooms felt like a slow suffocation. I focused instead on building routines. I ran at dawn even when my knees ached. I volunteered at a community center, teaching young girls self-defense. I poured myself into structure because structure was the one thing I could still control. But the wound was still there, just beneath the surface. Every time a holiday card arrived without my name, every time I saw photographs online of smiling faces where I should have stood, the wound pulsed. Silent but alive. The turning point came one summer evening when I attended a neighborhood barbecue. I had been invited by a family friend who still remembered me as the girl who used to babysit her kids. She hugged me warmly, pressed a plate into my hands, and asked me to join her table. Halfway through the meal, I overheard her husband mention Caroline's gala at the museum. Everyone at the table nodded knowingly, exchanging stories of the lavish decorations and the speeches that had filled the night. I sat there with a fork in my hand, realizing once again that I had been deliberately excluded. Something inside me shifted then. I was tired of being invisible, tired of carrying a silence that was never mine to bear. For years I had believed the battlefield was behind me, but I began to understand that the most relentless battles are the ones fought at home. That night, as I walked back to my apartment under a sky scattered with stars, I felt the first stirrings of defiance. I would not shrink for them anymore. They had tried to edit me out, but I was still here. And sooner or later, they would have to see me. Life after the army was quieter, but quiet did not mean peace. I traded desert nights filled with the thud of helicopters for mornings where the only sound was the drip of coffee in my small apartment. The silence was so heavy at first that it felt unnatural, as if the world had turned down its volume and forgotten me. I kept my routines the way soldiers do. Bed made tight, shoes lined near the door, files stacked neatly on the desk. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. The floorboards creaked and the walls were thin, but it was mine. The fridge was mostly stocked with eggs, spinach, and black coffee. I never learned how to fill a pantry the way my mother did. Instead, I lived light, as if deployment orders might arrive any morning. Sometimes I would stand at the window overlooking Main Street and watch the town carry on. Parents walked strollers. Teenagers carried backpacks. Couples lingered over coffee. The world spun on, ordinary and bright, while I carried memories that could never be ordinary again. Have you ever felt out of step with the rhythm of the world, as if everyone else is dancing and you are standing still? Share if you have. It is powerful when we recognize how many of us carry silent battles in the middle of everyday life. I needed purpose, so I found it in unexpected places. Through a veterans network, I was invited to consult with a task force. It was a joint operation that included local law enforcement, FBI agents, and a handful of specialists like me. My role was not glamorous. I was not undercover. I was not chasing suspects down alleys. I sat in briefing rooms, read case files, and trained young officers in crisis response. I explained how trauma manifests, how to read a room for tension, how to stay steady under pressure. The cases were heavy: human trafficking, exploitation, organized networks that thrived on silence and fear. The work reminded me of combat in a way I had not expected. Not the noise of war, but the moral weight of it. Knowing lives depended on whether we got it right. On Tuesday nights, I taught self-defense at the community center. A dozen women, some young, some gray-haired, lined up in sweatpants and sneakers. We practiced basic strikes and blocks. I taught them how to break a grip, how to use their voice as a weapon. Some came because they had been hurt before. Others came because they were tired of feeling small. Every week when class ended, I felt lighter, as if I had given away some piece of strength that grew back stronger in the giving. At night, I lay on my narrow bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and felt the ache in my shoulders. Sometimes the pain from old injuries woke me. Sometimes it was the dreams. Faces, sounds, explosions that rewound themselves without permission. I learned to breathe through it, to ground myself in the now. My family rarely called. When they did, it was polite, quick, full of chatter about Caroline's galas or Lily's children. They never asked about the task force. They never asked about the classes. It was easier for them to imagine me as the same restless girl with scraped knees. One afternoon, after a long session at the task force office, I stopped at the pharmacy. While waiting in line, I glanced at the headlines on a newspaper stand. The front page carried a story about a local business magnate, a man celebrated for his philanthropy and success. He was photographed at a gala, standing with city officials. My chest tightened. His name was already flagged in files I had read. Not enough evidence yet, but whispers of his involvement in trafficking circles had surfaced again and again. And then I saw the detail that made my pulse quicken. He was listed as a sponsor for Lily's wedding. It felt like the air was pulled out of the room. My sister's wedding, the same event I had been told not to wear my uniform to, was being funded in part by a man whose name I had seen in case notes thick with suffering. I left the pharmacy without buying what I came for. I walked down the street with the newspaper folded under my arm, my heart pounding. The lines between my professional life and my family's polished world had just collided. Have you ever had that moment when two parts of your life crash together and you cannot unsee the wreckage? That was mine. Tell me if you have lived that collision. Because in that moment, I knew nothing in my family's picture-perfect wedding would ever look the same again. I carried the folded newspaper back to my apartment and laid it on the kitchen counter as if it were something dangerous, something that might explode if I looked at it too long. I stared at the man's picture, his polished smile, the easy way he stood with officials as if he belonged in every corner of the city's elite. On paper, he was flawless, the kind of man my family admired. But in our files, his name was circled, highlighted, whispered over in late-night meetings. The next morning, I sat at the long table in the task force conference room. Charts lined the walls, photographs were clipped to boards, case numbers filled the air like smoke. When his name came up, my throat tightened. I listened as the lead agent walked through the connections, money trails that twisted through shell companies, whispers from survivors who mentioned a man with his profile. Nothing solid yet. Nothing we could take to court, but enough to know he was not clean. I should have spoken up, should have said that this man was sponsoring my sister's wedding, that my family was standing in his glow without knowing the shadows he carried. But the words stuck. I had spent years being told not to bring my world into theirs, not to let the weight of my uniform disturb their fragile picture. Old habits are hard to break. Instead, I went home that night and lay awake, the ceiling fan spinning shadows across my ceiling. I thought about Lily walking down an aisle lined with flowers paid for by dirty money. I thought about my mother greeting him with her practiced smile. I thought about how easily evil dresses itself in silk and smiles. Have you ever known something that burned inside you, but you stayed silent because you feared no one would believe you? If that has ever been your battle, share a thought in the comments. Sometimes silence can be heavier than war. The following week, I stayed late at the office, combing through files. I looked at photographs of women rescued from safe houses, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. I read reports of coded conversations intercepted on burner phones. Again and again, his name surfaced like oil on water. Every time I saw it, I thought of my family, of the way they had asked me not to wear my uniform, as if the truth of my life was something embarrassing. And now, unknowingly or not, they were celebrating under the roof of a man who profited from the pain of others. At the community center, during my Tuesday class, I pushed harder. I taught the women how to strike with elbows, how to break free even when fear froze their breath. One woman lingered after class, her arms folded tight. She told me she had left a controlling relationship and that learning how to fight back made her feel alive again. Her words clung to me as I locked up that night. Strength was contagious, so was silence. The city glittered with summer events. Caroline attended galas and posted pictures in gowns that sparkled under chandeliers. My mother bragged about her charity work. Lily sent me a brief text about wedding plans, ending with the reminder not to show up in uniform. I typed a reply but never hit send. Instead, I returned to the files. One night, as I sat in the dim light of the office, the lead agent leaned over my shoulder. He pointed at the photo of the businessman at a gala, the same one from the newspaper. "We are close," he said, "too close to risk leaks." His eyes met mine, steady and certain. "If you know anyone connected to him, keep your distance." The words chilled me, keep your distance. My own sister's wedding was being built on his money, and I was being told to stand back, to stay silent once again. I walked home through the humid night, my boots striking the pavement in rhythm with my thoughts. Silence had cost me too much already. Have you ever been told to stay quiet when every bone in your body wanted to scream? That is a question I ask you now, because silence can be its own kind of wound. Share what you think, because sometimes voicing it is the first step toward healing. I began to see the world differently after that. At the grocery store, I noticed the way clerks looked away when expensive cars pulled into the lot. At church, I heard the way people praised generosity without asking where the money came from. At family dinners, when I was invited, I watched them beam over invitations printed on thick paper and floral arrangements ordered months in advance. None of them asked the question that haunted me: whose suffering had paid for all that beauty? The closer the wedding came, the heavier the air felt. The task force gathered more evidence, piecing together patterns. Still not enough for a raid, but the picture was becoming clear. I knew the truth even if the world had not yet named it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of fire, I sat on my balcony and held the uniform folded in my lap. The same uniform my sister had asked me not to wear. The same uniform that held my blood, my sweat, my history. I traced the ribbons with my finger and felt something steady rise inside me. They wanted me invisible. He wanted to stay untouchable. But I was not made for invisibility. And I knew one day, very soon, our paths would collide under the same roof. The deeper I went into the task force work, the more I realized that the battlefield had simply changed its shape. Gone were the sands of Afghanistan, replaced by boardrooms and banquet halls. The uniforms were gone, but the enemy was the same. People who fed on the vulnerable, who thrived in shadows where no one dared to look. My role was to study behavior. I sat behind mirrored glass during interviews, reading the twitch of a hand, the shift of eyes, the subtle pause before a lie. I trained officers to listen beyond words, to hear what fear sounds like when someone is trying to be brave. I reminded them that trauma is not always loud. Sometimes it is silence. There were evenings when I left the office with my head heavy from the weight of it. I walked the quiet streets back to my apartment, shoulders aching, mind replaying voices of women who had survived what no one should ever endure. Their testimonies lingered in me. They became the unseen squad I carried, the ones I could not fail. One night, while briefing a group of young detectives, I spoke about patterns of control. I drew diagrams on the board, arrows showing how traffickers isolate victims, how they use charm in public and violence in private. As I spoke, I caught myself thinking of him, the businessman who smiled on the front page of newspapers, who shook hands with city leaders, who stood behind my sister's wedding as a sponsor. The thought chilled me. Have you ever looked at someone who seemed admired, celebrated, even untouchable, and felt in your gut that something about them was wrong? If you have, share it in the comments. Trusting our instincts is often the first step toward truth. 2 weeks later, the collision happened. My sister Caroline insisted I attend a charity auction at the country club, despite her usual reluctance to include me. She framed it as a chance for me to get out more. I suspected it was her way of proving I could still fit into their polished world. I almost said no, but some quiet part of me knew I had to go. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and laughter. Women in silk dresses floated past with champagne flutes. Men in tailored suits exchanged handshakes like secret deals. I felt the old weight of being out of place, but I squared my shoulders. I was not Evelyn the misfit tonight. I was Evelyn who had survived, Evelyn who had saved lives. And then I saw him, the man from the files, the philanthropist, the sponsor. He stood at the center of a circle of admirers, his laugh deep and practiced, his hand resting on the shoulder of a city official. He looked exactly as he did in the photos, immaculate, charming, magnetic. My chest tightened. Every instinct told me to move, to create distance. But I forced myself to stay calm. I had been trained for this, after all. In Afghanistan, I had stitched wounds with trembling hands while bombs echoed outside the tent. Surely I could hold my ground here in a room full of velvet and gold. I picked up a glass of water and sipped slowly, watching from the edge of the crowd. His gestures were precise. He touched his cufflinks often, a subtle habit. His smile widened only when people of power approached. He exuded control, the kind of control that hides darker truths. And then his eyes caught mine. Just for a second, but long enough. His gaze lingered, sharp and assessing, as if he were cataloging me. I felt the air thin. Did he know me? Did he sense my connection to the task force? My heart pounded, but I held steady, lowering my gaze as though uninterested. It was a dance I had not expected to perform outside of combat, the dance of appearing invisible while watching everything. Later that night, as I stood near the balcony doors, I overheard 2 women whispering. They spoke of him with admiration, but then one lowered her voice further. She mentioned rumors, dark rumors about his business trips and the kinds of people he entertained. The other woman hushed her quickly, glancing around as if even the air might betray her words. I froze. It was not just the task force that knew. Whispers had reached society too, my family's world. The realization stung sharper than anything else that night. If the whispers were in these halls, then surely Caroline and my mother had heard them. They moved in these circles. They knew these people, and yet they still chose silence. They still accepted his money, his sponsorship, his presence at Lily's wedding. On the drive home, the city lights blurred through my windshield. Anger and sorrow knotted in my chest. It was not just about him anymore. It was about them, my own family, willing to look away because the truth was inconvenient. Have you ever discovered that someone you love knew the truth all along but chose to stay silent? If you have, share a thought in the comments. It might be the hardest betrayal of all, and yet speaking it can lighten the weight. That night I lay awake, the uniform folded at the foot of my bed, and realized that the hidden battle was no longer only about him. It was about whether I would continue to carry silence or whether I would finally force the truth into the light. In the days after the charity auction, I could not shake the weight of his stare. It had been brief, but it carried something unsettling, as though he had filed me away in some mental ledger. I knew better than to imagine myself invisible. Men like him thrived on noticing people, calculating risk, cataloging who belonged and who did not. At the task force office, his name came up again. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the whispers were growing louder. Bank transfers, coded conversations, travel records that did not match his public calendar. Still not enough to bring him down. Not yet. I sat through those meetings, silent but burning inside, knowing that while we worked to connect the dots, my own family was preparing to toast him at Lily's wedding. One evening, I decided to confront the silence. Caroline had invited me to her townhouse, an elegant place with white walls and art that looked expensive but cold. She poured wine into a crystal glass for herself and water into a plain tumbler for me. That small act alone told me what she thought of us. I did not waste time. I told her plainly that the man sponsoring the wedding was under federal scrutiny, that there were serious questions about where his money came from. I expected shock, maybe fear. Instead, she sighed and rolled her eyes as if I were a child interrupting her dinner. "Evelyn," she said, lowering her voice, "do not start this here. People have always gossiped about powerful men. You of all people should know not to believe everything you hear." Her words sliced through me. Not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. She knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the case files, but she had heard enough to form her own quiet verdict. And still, she chose silence. Have you ever confronted someone with the truth only to watch them shrug it off? Because admitting it would ruin their comfort. If you have, leave a word in the comments. Sometimes just sharing the moment can ease its sting. I pressed her, asking if she wanted Lily's marriage tied to a man like that. She waved me off, saying the wedding was too far along, the contract signed, the guests invited. She leaned closer, her perfume cloying, and whispered, "Do not wear your uniform, Evelyn. Do not make this about you." I left her townhouse with my heart pounding. It was not just his money that stained the wedding now. It was their choice to accept it, to swallow the whispers, to pretend it was not there. That night I called Lily. She answered with her voice bright, distracted, full of lists and details. I tried to warn her gently, but she grew defensive, telling me not to ruin her big day with dark stories. She said Caroline told her I had a habit of dramatizing things. Her words echoed in me like a second rejection. So that was it. My sisters knew the rumors. Maybe my mother too. And all of them had chosen to bury the truth because admitting it would have meant tarnishing the image they had worked so hard to polish. At the next task force briefing, I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap as the lead agent discussed the suspect's growing connections. We were circling closer, he said. One day soon we would have enough. My throat tightened. I wondered what would happen if that day arrived before the wedding. If headlines broke open the very life my family had chosen to celebrate. On the walk home, I thought of all the times I had carried silence for them. At holidays, at dinners, in photographs where my story was cropped out. I had borne it because I thought silence was protection. But now I saw it for what it was, complicity. The battle inside me sharpened. One part of me wanted to scream the truth at them, to force them to see what they had chosen. Another part of me knew that words would not be enough. They had already decided what version of me they wanted. A sister muted, a sister hidden, a sister who did not disrupt the story. But weddings are about truth, whether people admit it or not. And the truth was waiting, sharp and unstoppable, just like the uniform folded in my closet. Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision, knowing that whatever choice you made would change everything? If you have, share how it felt in the comments. Because that is where I stood, between silence and light, between erasure and presence. The days ticked closer to the wedding, each one heavy with both dread and resolve. I kept working with the task force, teaching self-defense at the community center, running through my routines. Outwardly nothing changed. Inwardly everything did. Because now I knew the truth was not only hidden in case files. It was hidden in my family's choices, their silence, their willingness to trade honor for appearances. And I knew, when the wedding day arrived, that silence would no longer be mine to carry. The morning of Lily's wedding broke with soft sunlight filtering through my curtains. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the uniform folded neatly across a chair. Its dark fabric seemed to hold every chapter of my life stitched into its seams. Bronze star, service ribbons, the weight of battles fought and lives saved. For years I had hidden it away at the back of my closet, obeying the unspoken rule of my family. Do not remind us who you really are. But that morning I knew. This was not about revenge, it was about truth. It was about no longer shrinking into silence while my family clung to polished lies. I pressed the uniform with careful hands, smoothed the edges, polished the shoes until they shone. Every piece of it mattered. This was not just clothing. It was the story they refused to tell, and I would wear it even if it meant standing alone. The country club gleamed like a postcard when I arrived. Hydrangeas bloomed in white clusters by the stone steps, pastel dresses swept past like a sea of silk, valet drivers lined up in crisp jackets. My heart pounded as I stepped out of my car. I could almost hear Caroline's voice in my head, warning me not to make anyone uncomfortable. I adjusted the uniform's collar and walked forward anyway. The security guard at the door saw me, saw the insignia, and straightened to attention. He did not ask for an invitation. He simply nodded with quiet respect and stepped aside. In that moment I felt the shift, not as an outcast, not as a shadow, but as someone who belonged by virtue of service, not permission. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and polished laughter. Guests sipped champagne and adjusted cufflinks, their voices lilting like music. I walked slowly, boots soundless on the carpet, every step steady. Heads began to turn, first one then another, until the ripples spread. Conversations faltered. Whispers bloomed. Have you ever walked into a room knowing that every eye was on you, not out of pity, but out of something they could not quite name? If you have, tell me in the comments. That feeling can be terrifying and liberating all at once. I slipped into the back row of the ceremony hall, behind older guests murmuring about vineyards and stocks. The archway up front overflowed with flowers. Lily stood radiant in lace, her hand clasped in her groom's. Caroline moved gracefully among the guests, ensuring every detail appeared flawless. My mother sat in the front row, pearls at her throat, eyes bright with pride. None of them saw me yet. I was a shadow in uniform at the edge of their carefully staged world. And then from across the aisle I felt the moment. A man in a dark suit leaned forward, squinting. Recognition flickered. Another guest whispered, eyes darting toward me. A murmur spread like sparks in dry grass. Some had seen the news. The articles had mentioned a retired army officer serving as a consultant in a major human trafficking case. Few names had been given, but the face was familiar enough for those who had looked closely. The shame they had tried to pin on me began to unravel. I could feel it in the whispers changing pitch, in the glances shifting from confusion to awe. Suddenly, I was no longer the sister they had hidden. I was the soldier who had stood in the shadows of cruelty and refused to turn away. The vows carried on up front, but the current in the room had shifted. The man in the front row who had once chuckled at my absence now stared as if seeing me for the first time. Women whispered behind manicured hands, not with mockery but with intrigue. A few even leaned to tell others, that's her. I did not rise. I did not speak. I only sat steady, allowing the truth to do what silence never could. When the ceremony ended and guests spilled into the reception hall, the whispers followed me. I stood near the bar with a glass of club soda, listening to the hum. Two women spoke within earshot, one recalling the task force raid mentioned in the news, another connecting the details to my name. Their voices dropped when they realized I was standing 3 feet away. I turned to them calmly and said, yes, I am Evelyn Hayes. I am Lily's sister. Their eyes widened, polite smiles faltering into something closer to respect. One man asked if I was with law enforcement. I gave a small nod and said, I serve as a consultant. I help train those who protect the vulnerable. In that moment, silence was no longer my burden. It was theirs. Have you ever witnessed a shift where the very thing people dismissed you for became the reason they finally saw you? If you have lived that, I hope you share it in the comments. Stories like that remind us that perception is never permanent. I caught sight of Caroline across the room, her expression pale, her hand frozen on a champagne flute. My mother's face drained of color. Lily clutched her bouquet tighter. They had wanted a flawless picture, but the truth had walked in wearing a uniform. I barely had time to set my glass down before Caroline appeared at my side. Her smile was fixed too tightly, the kind that cracked under pressure. She slipped her hand through my arm as though we were close, though her grip was steel. With that same smile still plastered on her face for the watching crowd, she whispered through clenched teeth, "Come with me, now." She guided me toward a side corridor lined with portraits of men in tuxedos and women in gowns, the legacy of the country club etched in oil and frame. The noise of the reception dimmed as we moved away. Behind us I heard whispers still bouncing from table to table, my name carried like a ripple through a lake. In a quiet corner near the coachroom she dropped the smile. "What are you doing, Evelyn?" Her voice trembled not with fear but with fury. "You were told not to wear that, not to make this day about you." I met her gaze steadily. I told her I had not come to ruin anything. I had come to stand in the truth of who I was. For a moment she said nothing, and I saw the smallest crack in her polished exterior, a flash of something that looked like shame. Then Lily appeared, her gown gathered in one hand, eyes wide. She looked between us, between my uniform and Caroline's pale face. "Evelyn," she whispered, "why? Why here? Why today?" "Because," I said softly, "this is the day you wanted to begin your life with truth, and truth does not bend itself to comfort." My mother arrived last. She moved more slowly, her pearls glinting under the dim light. Her voice was low, almost pleading. "Couldn't you have respected this one day, just one day, without making it heavy?" I looked at the three of them, the family who had spent years tucking me away like something fragile or shameful. For the first time, I did not shrink under their judgment. I told them what I had carried, that I had stood in war zones, that I had held dying men's hands, that I had sat with survivors of trafficking whose voices broke under the weight of what they endured. I told them I had trained officers who saved lives, and that the man they had chosen to celebrate was the same man our task force was circling with evidence of crimes too dark to name. Caroline shook her head sharply. "Those are rumors," she said, her voice brittle. "That is not proven." But her eyes betrayed her. She knew, they all knew. They had simply chosen silence because silence was easier. Have you ever told the truth to someone who looked right at you and still chose to deny it? If you have, share a word in the comments. Sometimes speaking it out loud is the only way to reclaim your power. Lily's face went pale. Her lips trembled as she asked if what I was saying was true. I told her that while I could not share every detail, the evidence was real, and one day soon it would no longer be whispers. She looked down at her gown, her flowers, all the carefully chosen symbols of joy. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of it. Caroline snapped that I had no right to bring this into Lily's wedding. I answered quietly that they had no right to ask me to erase myself for their comfort. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For the first time, I watched them sit with the truth rather than bury it. Meanwhile, the reception buzzed on. But even from where we stood, I could hear my name whispered, could feel the shift in the air. Guests who had once dismissed me as the forgotten sister were now speaking of me as something else. Some came near to catch a glimpse, to connect the woman in uniform with the headlines they had read. When I returned to the hall, heads turned again. But this time their eyes were not filled with disdain. They were filled with something closer to reverence, or at least curiosity. People leaned in to shake my hand, to ask gentle questions, to thank me for service they barely understood. One older man clasped my hand and said, "You carry yourself with dignity, Captain. The world needs more of that." I nodded, my voice steady. "Thank you, but dignity is not mine alone. It belongs to all who stand in the dark and refuse to give in." Have you ever been in a room where the story people told about you finally cracked open and the real one poured through? If you have, tell me in the comments. It is in those moments that lives shift forever. As the evening stretched on, my family hovered at a distance. They had pulled me aside once, but they did not do it again. Perhaps they understood that the tide had turned. Perhaps they knew that no matter what they said, the uniform spoke louder than their disapproval ever could. I did not stay until the last dance. I slipped out quietly, walking through the lobby alone, but I did not feel alone. I felt the weight of silence finally lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I walked into the night not as the shadow of their shame, but as the woman I truly was. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the sky. I breathed deep and steady. This was not the end of the battle. The headlines would come. The truth about the man they had chosen to celebrate would surface. and my family would have to reckon with the choices they made. But that was not my burden anymore. That night, all I carried was the steady knowledge that I had stood, that I had refused to vanish, that I had let the truth be seen. I thought the night was finished when I stepped into the cool air beyond the reception hall, but I was wrong. Caroline's heels clicked sharply on the stone walkway behind me. Lily followed, still clutching her bouquet though the flowers had begun to wilt. My mother came last, her shoulders stiff, her pearls shining in the moonlight. They pulled me toward a quiet courtyard near the fountain. The music of the reception floated faintly from inside, muffled by walls of ivy. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air smelled of damp stone and flowers. My heart beat steady, not with fear, but with a clarity I had never known before. Caroline broke the silence first. Her voice was brittle. "Why would you do this to us? Why here? Why today?" I looked at her, at Lily, at my mother, and said softly, "I did not do this to you. I did it for me. For once in my life, I walked into a room as who I am, not the version you wanted me to be." My mother's lips trembled. "You could have told us. You could have prepared us." "Prepared you for what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Prepared you to look me in the eye and pretend you accepted me when you never have." The silence after that was heavier than any argument. I told them what I had carried all those years, that my silence was never shame, that it was duty, that when I came home broken and tired, they looked at me as if I were damaged goods, when in truth I was carrying the weight of men and women who never came back at all. Lily's eyes glistened. "Why didn't you just explain?" she whispered. "Because I said you never wanted to hear it. You wanted me cropped out of the picture, folded away from the frame. You wanted a version of me that fit your idea of family perfection. I am not that version. I never will be." Caroline crossed her arms. "You made this wedding about you." I shook my head slowly. "No, you made it about appearances. I only showed up as myself. Have you ever stood in front of people you loved and realized they loved only the version of you that made them comfortable? If you have, share it in the comments. Sometimes speaking it is the only way to loosen its grip." I turned to Lily then, her face pale beneath the glow of lanterns. I told her that the uniform was not just about war. It was about saving lives, about holding broken bodies together long enough for them to see another sunrise, about shielding the vulnerable when no one else would. The military was not the darkness they feared. It was the reason children were rescued, the reason mothers came home to their families, the reason silence was broken for those who could not speak for themselves. I said it plainly. "You fear that my uniform would make guests uncomfortable. But what should make us uncomfortable is injustice ignored, cruelty excused, truth silenced." Caroline turned away, her shoulders stiff. My mother wiped her eyes with the edge of her hand. Lily stood very still, caught between the wedding she had dreamed of and the truth she could no longer deny. The fountain bubbled quietly behind us. For a long time, no one spoke. And in that silence, I realized the reckoning had already begun. The silence between us stretched long enough for the music from the reception to drift back into focus. A band was playing something light, cheerful, as if joy itself could drown out the weight of truth. Caroline shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tight. My mother kept her eyes on the fountain, the water catching bits of moonlight. Lily gripped her bouquet until petals fell one by one to the ground. I felt strangely calm. For years I had carried their rejection like a wound that never closed. Tonight it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a scar, one I could trace with my fingers but no longer bled from. Caroline finally broke. "You humiliated us," she hissed. "All those whispers, the stares, you ruined her wedding." I met her words with steady eyes. No, I told her the truth. I reminded her that what I did tonight was not humiliation. It was honesty. And honesty does not ruin anything. It only shows what was already broken. Lily's face crumpled then, not because of me, but because she knew I was right. She whispered, "Is it true about him? The man sponsoring the wedding. Is it really true?" I did not want to crush her on her wedding day, but lies had already done that. I told her quietly that yes, his name had appeared again and again in case files, that his wealth was not clean, no matter how polished the gala photos looked. Her shoulders sank, the weight of a future tied to a lie pressing down on her. My mother spoke next, her voice softer than I had heard in years. "We did not mean to erase you, Evelyn. We just wanted peace." I swallowed hard. "Peace built on silence is not peace," I said. "It is denial. And denial eats away at everything until there is nothing left but rot. They looked at me, but I knew they did not yet understand. Perhaps they never would. Have you ever reached that moment when you realize the people you love may never see you clearly, no matter how plainly you stand before them? If you have, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Sometimes knowing we are not alone in that ache makes it easier to carry. The fountain gurgled steadily. The petals at Lily's feet floated on the water like fragments of a truth she could not hold onto. Caroline's arms folded tighter across her chest, as if protecting herself from a storm she refused to name. I told them one last thing. I said I was not angry anymore, that the hurt had already done its damage, but it no longer defined me. I told them my silence was never weakness, it was service. And tonight, by wearing my uniform, I had laid that silence down. I added, I am not asking you to accept me. I am asking you to sit with the truth of who I am. Whether you choose to carry it or bury it is not my burden anymore. None of them spoke. For the first time in years, their silence was not power over me. It was weight on them. I stepped back, gave them one last look, and then turned away. My boots clicked softly against the stone path as I walked out of the courtyard, past the ivy walls, past the glow of lanterns. I did not look back, not because I did not care, but because I did not need to. Inside, the music swelled. Laughter rose, glasses clinked. Life went on as it always does, but I carried with me something lighter, something fierce. I had not destroyed their perfect picture. I had simply walked into it as myself and once seen. I could never be unseen again. Outside, the night air was cool, brushing against my face like a benediction. I paused under the wide stretch of sky and breathed deep. For the first time in years, I felt free. Have you ever walked away from something heavy and realized you were finally lighter? Share that moment if you can. It is powerful when we recognize our own freedom. I drove home with the window down, the uniform still crisp against my shoulders. I passed quiet streets and sleeping houses. For once, I did not feel like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I felt alive, present, steady. When I reached my apartment, I hung the uniform back in my closet, not hidden this time, but centered. It belonged there, visible, a reminder of who I was. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window overlooking Main Street. Couples still walked arm in arm. A teenager laughed into his phone. The world spun on, ordinary and bright. But inside me, something had shifted. 3 years ago, I walked away from my family's table carrying shame that did not belong to me. Tonight, I walked away wearing every piece of who I had become. I was no longer the sister they pitied or the name they avoided. I was the woman they could never erase. When I stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapped around me like a blessing. The music from the wedding drifted faintly behind me, a reminder of the world I had left inside. Yet as I walked toward my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. My steps carried no weight of shame, no need to apologize, no urge to explain. For the first time, I belonged fully to myself. 3 years ago, I had been cast as the family's shadow, the secret tucked away, the sister whose presence was an inconvenience. Back then, I let their silence become my own. I let their rejection shape the way I looked at myself. I believed, even if only for a while, that maybe I was less. Tonight, everything shifted. Not because they accepted me, they did not. Not because they asked forgiveness, they could not. It shifted because I stood in my own truth, and once I did, nothing they thought of me could erase it. Honor does not come from applause. It does not come from carefully staged photographs or whispered approval in crowded rooms. Honor is forged in quiet moments when no one is watching, in the choices that cost you comfort but save your soul. Honor lives in the scars you carry and the lives you touched, even if those lives never know your name. I thought for a long time that I needed my family's recognition to make my life whole. But the truth is, their refusal to see me taught me to see myself more clearly. It pushed me to learn that dignity cannot be handed down by anyone else. It has to rise from within. When I looked at them one last time tonight, I realized something. They had wanted me to wear silence so they could keep their picture perfect. But when I finally walked into that room as myself, their silence became their burden, not mine. That is what freedom feels like. Have you ever had to reclaim a part of yourself that others tried to erase? If you have, I hope you share it here. Stories like that have power. They remind us that no matter how much others may try to define us, the truest definition is the one we choose for ourselves. As I drove home, the uniform still crisp on my shoulders, I thought about the men and women I served with, about the nights in field hospitals and the mornings that broke after nights that seemed endless. I thought about those who never made it back, and I knew that if I carried their memory with honor, I would never again let anyone reduce me to a shadow. 3 years ago, I walked away from my family carrying shame that was never mine. Tonight, I walked away wearing every piece of who I had become. I was not the sister they pitied, not the secret they tried to hide. I was a woman who had stood in war, who had healed the broken, who had spoken truth even when it cost her the love she longed for. I was no longer invisible. I was unforgettable. So here is the truth I leave you with. Honor does not come from being accepted. It comes from standing in the light of your own story, even if others turn away. The world may never applaud, but your heart will know the difference. And if this story has spoken to you, if it has stirred something in your own memory or reminded you of your own strength, I invite you to stay with us. Before you go, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here at Military Revenge, we share stories every week about courage, resilience, and the unseen battles carried by veterans, especially women whose sacrifices are too often forgotten. I would love to know where you are listening from and what time of day it is in your corner of the world. Drop it in the comments. And if you feel ready, share your own story of courage, of reclaiming your truth, of standing in the light after years in the shadows. Your words may be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Because at the end of the day, this channel is not just about stories like mine. It is about all of us. About the ways we rise even when the world asks us to shrink. About the dignity we find when we refuse to let anyone else decide our worth. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. And remember, honor is not given, it is lived.